Ding dong, that means we are live. I did find out when that bell rings, that means we're actually live. The people can see us, even though it tells me it's setting up our YouTube Zoom link.
Well, I see a thing up at the top that says live on YouTube right now on the Zoom link. So
Ding dong, that means we are live. Oh, there's remember I got 9 screens up at the same time. Let's pull this up.
let's see. Oh, that's not what I want to do.
It's hard to believe. Episode 8 today. That's crazy. Time is going rapidly.
All right.
Rapido.
At least I don't have an aura today.
You always have an aura, Father.
There's a little bit of an aura right here.
The Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit like just pick one part of my body and glow. But the thing to remember, that means that all the rest of this, that's still not sanctified.
We're getting there. It's a sanctification is a process. Good morning, everybody. I don't know who's here. I'm trying to get there. Let's see who we got. My thing is not showing live yet. It takes a while. So how was your morning today?
Actually, smoother than usual.
Sunny day of Ohio.
Good morning, Rich. But you know what? It's fall, and I like these days too. I do like crisp, clean, clear fall days, but I also like cloudy every once in a while.
Wow, that's Ohio.
Well, don't forget I grew up in St. Louis, so also, basically 3 days of fall, 3 days of spring, everything else is summer and winter.
Yeah.
And usually not even good winter, right? It's like lots of ice. Maybe some snow finally comes down in January or February.
All right, here you go. Good morning, Rich. Yeah, we're in the gray haze now till April.
It works for me.
I mean, I'm okay with it till after Christmas. Epiphany, that's when I'm done with it. That's when you get into the bleh. Then you have January, February, then it's Lent.
Well, I think in COVID, it's just all blah.
That's true. Rich said he was in Missouri recently, Columbia, Missouri to be exact, and 86 one day and 46 the next.
That's right. That sounds right. St. Louis is just like that too.
Yeah, it's 40 degrees swipe. It's pretty good. Good morning, everybody. We got 3 people watching. That's probably me, you, and Rich. That's all right. They will come. It takes a little bit for it to get uploaded into the system.
Bouncer. Are you bouncer?
Chris normally comes in to be the bouncer. It'll just take a little bit for her to get here. So here we are, October the 28th, Feast of St. Simon and Jude. I feel like since we are dealing with the election, we should be praying to St. Jude. Do you know why St. Jude is the patron saint of hopeless causes, by the way?
No.
It's because since his name was Judas, people got him confused with the other Jude. So the only people who would pray to him are people that were really super lost and just were trying to pray to everyone. That's how he ended up the patron saint of lost causes. Kind of fun.
Well, it's just a day that
that's what I read.
My mom's name is Judy, but it's spelled Jude, so it's just a reminder to call my mom.
Oh yeah, you should call your mom.
I should call my mom. I'm not good at that stuff.
Rich, you won't get bounced, I promise.
Don't worry, Rich. Hi, Chris. Chris is here.
Chris is here, the bouncer. Chris the bouncer. Actually, she told me the new word is, and I keep talking about it, is zergers.
Yeah, I'm not going to use that word.
Zerger. It's kind of fun. I like that zergers have a big stick and swat people away.
I don't know how you do that digitally.
You just right-click delete. That's how that works.
Yeah, but if we're going to actually have something called a zerger, then I want some kind of GIF that pops up and actually shows a verger hitting somebody with the stick.
Yeah, karate chop to the neck. Chris, do you like? We want to. I wish we got to find you an emoji that you can put up after you've stirred someone to better and greener pastures.
I mean, hitting somebody with a stick, you have to do it non-violently, obviously. You have to do it the way Jesus would.
Jesus made a whip in the temple.
He did.
You know, I was actually talking to someone before who said Jesus, when he did that, he never raised his voice. He just slowly closed up shop tables and folded things nicely as he left the temple. I said, I don't think that's how that would have worked.
I have to look back at the text, but that's not the impression the text gives.
Yeah, because that would be anger. And now it's like, well, there is such a thing as righteous anger against evil.
Yep. Right. There's nothing wrong with anger. Hi, Don. It's it's hate that's the problem, not anger. God gets angry all the time.
Yeah, I just don't see Jesus being quiet in that moment.
Well, he might not have said anything, but it wouldn't have been a like, I'm being polite not saying anything. It's a, I'm too busy knocking this stuff over not saying.
Morning, Carolyn.
Hi, Carolyn.
Ooh, I gotta get my clock ready. We got a lot to talk about today. Maybe
not nearly as much as the last couple of weeks.
I feel like today we probably should have done a part 2 today from last week.
It was a lot, and I was kind of thinking, like, I felt a little scattered over last week in particular, but both weeks. It was just a lot to wrestle with.
Maybe we should have a part 2 timer. There we go. Yeah, because last week was pretty hefty. People were thinking, though, if any of you have follow-up questions, make sure you send them in. We need questions in 3 questions, 2 priests, by the way. So send some questions in to 3 questions and 2 priests at questions@allsaintsnewalbany.org so we can get those up.
I'm always worried that people get intimidated by the questions that we've had before. There's nothing wrong with asking, why
do we wear green?
Yes, those kind of questions are totally fine. So it's whatever you want to ask. It can be deep. It can be very simple. It doesn't matter.
We should just do like a lightning round simple questions episode. Then maybe we break the whole 20 minute per question stuff and just do a bunch of fiery quick questions.
Right. like a trivia challenge. Because I'll fail that.
Listen, by the way, folks, before we get on live, Father Rob and I we'll make sure we know what we're going to talk about before we jump on. And always both of us are like, I don't know if we're going to have a whole lot to say on this question. And then we end up talking till the bell rings. So no, there's no fail here. No fail. Let's start in 3 minutes. That gets some. I've noticed our numbers are climbing. We're up to 9. Woohoo! 9 people today. Oh, so yeah. How's everyone out there in TV land? It's a big week coming up with festivities. All Saints Day, All Souls Day, the fall Triduum, so to speak, of All Hallows Eve and All Hallows.
The big Imperial Liturgy on November 3rd.
The big Imperial Liturgy on the 3rd. It's just a week of festivities. Rich Delana says, maybe you two could each have a buzzer to answer. Me.
But see, if we do that, then I want people who like are judges who score us.
Yeah, hold up numbers.
Yes.
Like a Jeopardy game. Wouldn't that be funny if Alex Trebek? I think he's a Catholic. Isn't he a Catholic?
That I don't know. I do know he has cancer, I think, and I think they're trying to find a replacement.
I read it's his last year.
Well,
November 3rd is all voting day.
Voting day.
Yeah, I think he has pancreatic cancer, I think.
Which that would be amazing if he's actually still doing it then, because that's a pretty brutal.
Yeah.
He's been doing it forever, like 1,000 years.
Yeah. That's a long time.
It's a very long time. He started it during the Great Schism.
I was going to say, before St. Francis, there was Jeopardy.
Yes. Carolyn's saying we should see how many questions we can answer in 20 minutes.
2. It wouldn't even take us that long. It take us 20 minutes to read.
I think it depends on how satisfactory you want the answer to be. I mean, I can give you an answer in a minute, but you may not like it.
Well, to set the stage for today, because we're going to start here in about a minute. To set the stage today, all of the questions are around election and voting and faith. Okay. I thought I was thinking about this today. I'm going to read all 3 questions before we start so that people have an idea where we're going to go, because a lot of times Father Rob and I obviously know we're going to talk, what questions are coming up, and our answers bleed into the other ones. But I thought it may be good for you all to hear where we're headed and see how things are going to, fit in, answers are going to fit into various questions. So the 3 questions we have for today. First one is, we're back to Boise. Flights must be cheap to Boise. So there's a lot of theological action back in Boise. So Cynthia from Boise asks, why should my faith have any bearing on my vote? Shouldn't we be separating politics from religion? So question 1 is, why should my faith have any bearing on my vote? Shouldn't we be separating politics from religion? Second question comes from Kookie from Boise. Is one issue sufficient reason to vote for a candidate, namely abortion? Is one issue sufficient reason to vote for a candidate, namely abortion? And 3, Joseph from Boise. How do we deal with the political divide that is sweeping our nation? What's a good Christian to do? So Joseph from Boise, how do we deal with the political divide that is sweeping our nation? What's a good Christian to do? So those are the 3 questions we're going to be tackling today. Chris is so kind to put those over in the live chat so we can go there. But let's get started. It's quarter till 10. You know the rules of engagement, 20 minutes per question. Time starts after I read the question. Question 1, why should my faith have any bearing on my vote? Shouldn't we be separating politics from religion? And go. I feel like these questions are all right up your alley, Father Rob.
I mean, the first part of that question is where it gets longer. I think the second part is, shouldn't we be separating politics from religion? You can't. It's just that simple. So I think the question becomes why.
I'm gonna play debate moderator today, and I'm gonna tease out some stuff. So I think let's discuss terms. You know how I like to discuss terms pretty quickly. So I think people get lost in when we should be separating politics from religion. Well, what's the definition of politics?
Right.
What does that mean? Let's start there, and then you can see how you can't separate your faith from that.
Well, and again, if what you mean is electoral politics or whatever, then sure, you can, in theory, by saying we won't talk about who you should vote for, which is that's a legal thing that we have to go by in the United States. By the way, they don't do that in most countries in Europe. Churches can say, and that's because a lot of those churches are established, so they can do what they want. So sure, I think you can separate out in that sense. Like, we don't have to say you should vote for this person or that person, or you should vote for this particular what item on the election thing. But politics, I mean, that's just the way that people organize their lives, and it has to do with power, how power is exercised, all that kind of stuff. So it's just, by definition, you can't separate the two out.
Yeah. So the Webster definition, that's what I was looking up really quick, is politics means the activities associated with the governance of a country or another area, especially the debate or conflict among individuals or parties, or hoping to achieve power.
Right. It has to do with power. And when we say other area, I would really even want to broaden that out as widely as possible, because you could say like a state or a city or whatever. But I mean, there's politics in the workplace, there's politics in the church, there can be politics in the family. So politics is just everywhere.
Yeah, polis means the city, so it's the Wikipedia, from whom all truth flows. It makes it a little bit more generic and says politics is the set of activities that are associated with making decisions in groups or other forms of power relationships between individuals, such as the distribution of resources or status.
Well, and so and this is why I want to like go just jump right into the religion part in general. I mean, so even if you look at that, I guess some people would want to say, well, the church shouldn't care about that. But I think the only way you can say that is if you've never read the Bible. Because
you deadpanned that too. You had a straight face when you said that.
Well, I mean, it's just the subject of the Bible is politics in that broad sense. It's about power. And it's about relationship. So, who has the power, and what is the relationship? So, does Pharaoh have the power, or does God have the power?
Mm-hmm.
So does Caesar have the power, or does Jesus have the power? You have to you start developing what power means and that kind of stuff. But I mean,
what's interesting too is I like that definition from the Wikipedia, because it talks about making decisions on behalf of groups. Well, once again, when you read the Bible, it deals more with groups than it does individuals.
Yeah, absolutely.
The 10 Commandments weren't just given to Moses; they were given to the totality of Israelites as well as the whole world, and it's a group guideline.
Right, to live as a people.
Right.
So it's not just about, when I read the Sermon on the Mount, I should turn the other cheek. We are a people who do not respond to violence with violence. That's what's happening. And I look at the why question, because I think we can back into that and then come back out and show how it's in the Bible. The why question: if you have a God who claims to be the ruler of the universe, that's already sort of making political claims, unless you're just going to make that so abstract that it's meaningless. If you have a God who acts in history and breaks the power of, sequentially, Pharaoh, Babylon, Rome over God's people, then that's a God who is getting into history and taking sides about where the power is. If you've got a God who says that every 7 years we're going to be freeing up people and canceling debts and this kind of stuff, that's a God who's messing with where the power is. So you've got this God in history, and more than that, God becomes flesh and enters the world in Jesus, and could have done that in Jerusalem, which would have made a whole lot of sense. That's where the king goes, but came in among the working class and poor people, the subsistence farmers in Nazareth and the construction workers, and chose that, and was confronted by the powers, both in Jerusalem and vicariously from Rome. So that's all political from top to bottom, and a God who cares about creation isn't going to just let politics go whatever way. So God does care. You've got some tricky stuff with Romans 13 about you have to follow, God puts these sort of political powers in place to sort of create order, to make it possible for us to sort of live in a way that makes sense, which is all fine unless you've got Hitler or whatever pop up. But then to answer that, you've got Revelation 13 and really the rest of Revelation, which is about recognizing that sometimes that power goes deeply wrong. And that in all cases, even when God sets up the power, according to Romans 13, that's always provisional. That for Christians, the real ruler of the universe is Jesus. And again, that's not just an abstract sort of, it is a spiritual idea, but it's not a spiritual idea in the way we usually mean it, which means it's meaningless. Jesus is my personal Lord and Savior, but nobody else's. No, he's the Lord of creation, or he's not anything. So it's just by definition political. By definition political.
That's why I always get, I'll have people say to me, "Oh, well, the church is too political right now." I've had that said to me several times, and I always talk, we keep talking about where you are hearing a gospel preached to you at all times,
All time.
at all times, whether you want to believe it or not. You're getting a gospel preached to you. I hope you're hearing the gospel, not the empire's gospel. But we live in a time now where, sadly, because of social media, 24-hour news sources, no matter what news source you're using, watching or using or reading or whatever, you are getting preached some form of gospel and propaganda. And what has happened in our church is that we take political party platforms as the gospel. I love it how we will say at one time the church is too political, and then at the same time believe that our political party's platform is the gospel truth because that's the political party that God chooses to belong to.
Right.
It's quite hysterical. But people will say to me, "Well, the church is too political right now," and I always like to say, "What does that mean?" And I think we're using terms, like you like to say. I think we're using terms we're not necessarily on the same page what those terms mean, because
Yeah.
by definition, the word political is about decisions of power and the decisions in group activities, which God has given us a list of
Yeah. Right.
for our betterment to make us fully human and fully alive.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, Stanley Hauerwas quotes, and I can't remember which rabbi he's quoting, and he says, a religion that doesn't tell you what to do with your pots and your pans and your genitals, like, is a religion that's not worth anything. And that's basically what they're trying to get at is, religion is about here and now as much as it is anything else. And that, because those day-to-day things also have all this sort of political meaning and political power. And if you pull out, because this is what's the other option, right? If the church is being too political, we want the church to be apolitical, right? So if the church pulls out of the political arena, then all you're left with is Republican, Democrat, whatever, some sort of political party, whatever. Right? So why do we want to say that the church has something to say about my personal life, but not about my political life? And in any case, how can I live anything in my personal life in a place in which living that life has become harder? You know what I mean? Like, part of what you have to do is set up an environment in which it's easier to live out the life that you're called to live, or at least that it's not impossible.
Right. Oh my gosh, there's a pause in the conversation.
Well, so I mean, one of the things that this is my line. I think I've probably said it at All Saints. I know I've said it when I've preached at various places on, like, Martin Luther King Day, for example. Because one of the things that I get cranky about is that the church lists Dr. King as having been assassinated. And I think maybe the new LFF has finally changed this. He needs to be called a martyr. Because he's not a political figure in the raw sense. He's a Christian, and everything that he did in the civil rights movement was out of his Christianity, and it was all political. And so part of the thing that I like to ask is, when Moses stands in front of Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go," is that a religious event? Or is that a political event? The answer, of course, is yes.
It's true. It's true.
Right? And so, there is this weird idea that somehow that maybe even Judaism was political and that Christianity became spiritual and doesn't need to worry about that stuff anymore. But if we worship a God who cares about us enough to give us sacraments, who cares about us enough to, it wasn't just that Jesus came and taught and gave some teachings that we're passing on. He built a community around himself, and a community is, again, by definition, political. And then also all the terms that the church used, the early church used. Christ is a political term. Parousia is a political term. A basilica is a political place. It's like you start going through the list of the Basileia, the kingdom is a political term. That's not by accident. they knew what they were doing. And so when they said, if the earliest creed is Jesus is Lord, what you're saying, the reason that you say that is that you're making a political claim and a spiritual claim that no one else is. Or in as much as I recognize the authority of anyone else, it's derivative of him. So that's political, and people need to understand that in his time, and in St. Paul's time, and in the early church's time, and before that, and through big chunk after, there wasn't like there was a secular Roman Empire and then there were a bunch of people who had different religions or whatever. You either got on board with the Roman religion or you didn't. And if your religion was seen as something that was incompatible with it, then it was a problem. That's why Jews had such a hard time working with Rome, because Rome needed them to trade in coins that had the Roman image on it. They needed them to offer a pinch of incense to Caesar. I mean, Caesar was seen as a divine figure. So the empire itself was by definition religious. And so when St. Paul would call Jesus Lord, he was saying Caesar's not Lord. That's super political. That's why those folks were getting killed left and right. It was a political movement, and that didn't mean it wasn't a religious or a theological movement. It was all of those things, because no one would have understood the idea of separating those things out at that time. That didn't make sense.
No. I always try to figure out, like, when people say to me the church is too political, or, sermons are too political, or blah, 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 where, I guess looking at it from a devil's advocate perspective as to why that may be the case is because it has to do with power. We have seen our modern political world for the last 30, 40 years turn deeply power hungry. I don't think any of us would say politicians are truth tellers. What they say one year is quite different than the other, and they're really just using and saying stuff to either get power or hold on to power and use it to abuse people who are an opposite party to stay in power. And so I think I could see where people, when they say politics, that's maybe what they mean.
Sure.
But the fact of the matter is it is like you've been saying, it is a power game, and the power game is between empire and kingdom.
Right. And the way that Jesus exercises power, and therefore the way that the church is to exercise power, is actually by suffering it and overcoming it with love. So even the way we do power is radically different from the way empire, broadly speaking, but just politics is usually done. Well,
and I think you're right. It boils down to the love answer, right? And so when when God has given us things in scripture of how we should be governed as a people, it's basically to teach us how to love and what love is. That's where it all boils down to.
Right. And that's the thing is we shouldn't blow off what kind of power that is, because again, civil rights movement is a great example of how that played out. Is how love power, nonviolent love power, can actually change the world. South Africa is another example. They're still working on it. We're still working on it here. But look at the amazing changes that happened through nonviolent action. Gandhi in India. So, there are these places where you see that when you recognize that love isn't just this sort of sentimental feeling that I have for somebody, but it is itself already political and is a way to live it's a way to exercise power. Love is actually, this is the Christian claim that is, I think, the reason that we devolve to the politics as we understand them is because it's so hard to believe that one of the central Christian claims, which is love is actually the greatest power in the universe.
Right.
That nothing can kill it. That's what the resurrection is.
Right. The passion, death, and resurrection was the most nonviolent, yet the most reality-changing event that we've ever experienced.
There is nothing more powerful. There's no greater exercise of real power than the resurrection.
Yeah.
Maybe creation itself. I don't know.
Well, but creation itself was an act of love.
Absolutely.
The reason why creation isn't exist. God doesn't need anything to make God better,
right,
or whole or complete. And so this kind of community of persons of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit creates the cosmos so that others can share in the love of the Trinity. That's the whole. It's love.
Absolutely. Right. So I think what we could say is maybe the church sometimes um, gets too political in a bad way, gets too political in the sense of behaving too much, uh, acting too much in empire's politics. The church has its own politics. So Jesus is not a Democrat or a Republican. Well, but I mean that in a good way. I mean the church, as the church in its best,
Mm,
is itself already. It is it's like the embassy of the kingdom of God sitting in the middle of empire.
right.
So in as much as we behave within the church or as Christians outside of the church, um, in the way that empire does, like actually being afraid and wanting to exercise that kind of sort of controlling power, then we're just not being the church. But in as much as we're brave enough to trust that God can raise us from the dead, then we can act with love, not out of fear. And that's the real political power.
Mother Tricia just messaged in here that Tertullian called the cross a taunt of empire and death.
Yeah, absolutely. Tertullian's awesome, by the way.
Yeah, I mean Tertullian. When you read Tertullian, you should make the sign of the cross for everything that you do. When you put on your shoes, you take a bath, you grab something to eat, you walk down the street, because he was basically just taunting death the whole time.
Absolutely, right. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So
Go through exorcism and watch what the power of the cross does. We should have talked about exorcisms. We're this close to Halloween. Maybe that's our next episode. How about this? Once again, we won't have enough time to answer this. We got a little less than a minute to chat about this topic, but it's going to spill into question 2, because then we're going to actually talk about how our faith, what points of the faith that God, of the things that God has given us, requires us to discern as we vote for candidates or policies or things of that nature. That's what we'll be getting to too. But if anyone has any follow-up clarifying questions, shoot them in. We love to kind of banter back and forth with that. And so it's just not Father Rob and I just chatting among ourselves, even though it's kind of fun to banter.
It is fun. I mean, it is funny to think about voting, which I guess we're going to talk in the next one about it. But
because the next one, let's just jump to the next one. We're ready. That was only 8 seconds left. Let's start question number 2. Because I've been hearing this a lot. I've been seeing it on Facebook a lot. This comes from Kookie from Boise. Is one issue sufficient reason to vote for a candidate, namely abortion? So is one issue sufficient reason to vote for a candidate, namely abortion? And go. I always say go, which means Father Rob, you can start.
There's a South Park episode where I think it's Kenny's it's not Kenny. I forget the names of the kids. One of the kids, Cartman's, I think like grandfather wants to die and he wants to commit suicide because he's just tired. He's so old, he's tired of living. And he asks Cartman to kill him. And Cartman's he's going through this whole sort of emotional thing about like, I don't know if I can do this and whatever. So he's calling up a talk show, and he actually, in the South Park world, Jesus has a talk show. So he calls up Jesus to ask him, is it okay to do this? And Jesus says, I wouldn't touch that question with a 10-foot pole, and just hangs up on it. I sort of feel like, I mean, my basic answer to this is one issue sufficient reason to vote for a candidate? Mostly I would say probably no. But everything else I'm afraid to talk about with this question.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. So this is I don't know. I'll be honest with you. I've been hearing this a lot from some of my Catholic friends, my Catholic brothers and sisters. And some of them are struggling with various candidates and positions or things of that nature, and that seem on 99 positions to line up more with the faith, but on one position may or may not line up with the faith. And so how should that work, or what should, and I will say this, and Father Rob and I were talking about this, comparing the Roman Church to the Episcopal Church, at least in regards to education and catechesis surrounding forming your conscience, looking at the holistic understanding of our faith in regards to political issues and things of that nature, I think does a far better job than our church does in the format of just listing stuff. As I said to Father Rob, if you type in social justice positions in the Episcopal Church, you're never going to find a holistic list that hasn't been compiled, which I wish there was, because I find that very helpful as you're discerning who to vote for, that you read through the positions of the faith and of the church, especially in General Convention, of where the Episcopal Church has taken various positions that should inform your conscience. I think so often we just go to the polls and, well, we don't pull levers anymore. You push buttons, for whatever political gang sign we feel like we most align with, and not really chew into some of this stuff and really form our conscience about why we're voting for which position or policy or person, in regards to the totality of our faith. And Empire loves to pick one issue and focus us on that, where we kind of lose the forest from the trees, so to speak. But the Catholic Church put out this huge document this year called Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And I got to say this to some of my Catholic brethren, paragraph 42 begins, as Catholics, we are not single issue voters. A candidate's position on a single issue is not sufficient to guarantee a voter's support. Now, they will kind of expand it, because one of the forming of a conscience has to deal with avoiding good and doing evil. So avoiding policy persons that support intrinsically evil acts.
You don't want to avoid good and do evil. You want to avoid evil.
I had a little theological dyslexia there. I'm sorry. So they would say that intrinsic evil acts for the Roman Catholic world would be such things as legal abortion and marriage issues. They also include this year racist behavior. And those things would, a voter may legitimately disqualify a candidate from receiving support. But it's interesting that even in the Catholic world, the Roman Catholic world, which tends to be a little bit more black and white than the Episcopal world is, that they clearly say that there is no such thing as a single issue voter, that we have to look at the totality of the person and how that particular person most matches up to what we say would be the beliefs of the church. Because we're really electing representatives who are voting and doing work for us. That's what we're doing.
Right.
That's hard to line someone up 100% with each of our values.
I would say you can. And I'd also say that in the even in what the Roman Church is trying to do by saying this, some of these particular acts can disqualify somebody. The problem is there are candidates for whom they do all of them. So then what are you going to do?
What do you do? Right.
All the candidates do, fall on one side or the other of that. I mean, I'm looking back at Rich's question in the feed. Would Jesus want us to vote at all? I think it's a good question. I mean, again, I always go back to, we assume now in our world a time and a place. So America's a generally kind of Christian country, it's in the sense of the majority is still Christian at this point. We come out of Europe, most of us, or a lot of us come out of Europe or the European tradition where Christianity is the dominant thing. But early church, I like to think like St. Paul was a Roman citizen, so he did participate in some way in the life of Rome. But like, I don't think St. Paul would, if a governor of Judea had said, St. Paul, could you come? I'm just being installed as the new governor of Judea. Could you come and offer a prayer for my installation? I don't think he would do it. And so I do think the deeper question about what Rich is asking is, what is our relationship to the sort of political structure that we find in which we find ourselves, and how do we act in it? And so I would say, if St. Paul is an example, he took advantage of what was available to him in the Roman Empire. So if you read Acts, there's a point at which he's getting in trouble. They're trying to take care of business. They want to send him to Jerusalem, whatever. He says, nope, send me to the emperor. And it gets him to Rome. Now, I don't think he thought he was going to change the empire by making these moves, but it gave him a chance to sort of talk to the churches on the way and to spread the word and all that kind of stuff. So I do think that Christians need to think a lot more creatively about this and not think, and I think this is our problem, is we think that somehow we're going to find this silver bullet candidate who's going to do everything we want them to do, and that will free us from having to do anything ourselves. Most political work takes place between elections. Voting is not exercising political power. It's a very small version of exercising political power. I am pro voting, but we need to do a lot more than voting. Voting isn't the thing. Voting's sort of the culmination of all the work that led up to the election, or the issue, voting on the issue. So I do think that's a really good question that Rich is asking, like, what's it mean to vote?
So kind of getting back to that second question about sufficient reason, it was one issue. I think we need to go back into our baptismal covenant. One of the things that we profess to do with God's help is to strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being. That's a good foundation for how our conscience should be formed when we go into the polling place locations to vote for positions or candidates, respecting the dignity of every human being. Sometimes you use the phrase from womb to tomb, but respecting the totality of the person, and that covers all kinds of things. And the environment that we live in, the creation care and how a particular candidate or issue affects the way that the world is treated is a part of that as well too. Let alone issues of poverty and healthcare and
economics in general, right? So Walter Brueggemann, I remember one of the great joys of my ordained life was getting to become friends with Walter while I lived in Cincinnati, and he did. He's since moved on from there. But Walter would talk about Price Hill's one of the rough neighborhoods in Lower Price Hill in particular in Cincinnati, and he would talk about like that there are multiple kinds of violence. So there's the immediate violence of a terrorist attack, but then there's the slow motion violence of poverty in a place like Price Hill. So all these people who day in and day out are suffering, and their lives are being shortened because they don't have adequate health care. They can't afford good food. They don't have the time to make their own food, so they're buying fast food, all this kind of stuff that goes with that. But that's no less violence just because it's slow motion. Again, we need to sort of like crack open our imaginations about it instead of like just going along with the way people talk about it. I have to tell you, I don't have regular television. I don't have cable television. And I haven't watched news for like 4 years or so from any corporate news thing. And it's radically changed the way I understand things. Because there's a benefit to the folks in power, and corporations are obviously among the people in power, to present things a certain way, to even ask the question a certain way. And Christians need to constantly be pushing back against even how the question's asked.
Well, because there's so many issues surrounding the dignity of the human person and justice and peace among all people, that God has. I mean, Jesus spoke more about money than he did about abortion or gay marriage, but in some of the religious right, we hear that those are the only two things that matter.
In fact, literally, unless you want to talk about sort of kind of a plenary inspiration, and so that even when Paul writes something, Jesus is talking. Jesus literally said nothing about either abortion or gay, same-sex relationships or whatever. Literally said nothing about either. So, and said a ton about money. But one of the funny things is the church almost never talks about the economic issues. It only talks about usually only talks about issues of sexuality.
And I have to say, one of the beefs I have with the Episcopal Church is that even when we discuss, we don't really dive deep into moral social theology.
Right.
We talk about action and ways to kind of go address particular issues. but very rarely do we flush out the moral teaching and the theology that underpins all of that.
It's there. It just almost never makes it to the pews, and it never makes it to. I mean, there are great. Sam Wells is a great example. He's really good moral theologian. Stanley Hauerwas is technically a Methodist, but he has been going to an Episcopal church for decades now, and he calls himself an Episcopalian at this point. They're both amazing, doing amazing work in moral theology. And I think part of the problem is seminaries tend to divide this stuff up, right, into we have these things called systematic theology, moral theology, whatever. Whereas in the first centuries, it's really up until pretty recently, that God was Trinity had told you how to behave. Do you know what I mean? Like that God took flesh had all this sort of moral theological stuff in it, and they wouldn't have separated that stuff out. And again, that means it has political content too. I see the question down here about, I think most people are centrist, just leaning left or right. And I, again, have said this in multiple contexts, including at All Saints, but in other places. Left and right are American terms. Left and right are sort of modern political terms. Left and right don't mean anything to Christians. And the silly way I like to say that is asking me if I'm a liberal or a conservative or a leftist or a right-wing person is like asking someone, who's Jewish if they're a Catholic or a Protestant. Those are two denominations of a religion to which I do not belong. So Christians need to stop letting themselves be bound by those kind of terms too. I don't know what they mean. What I do know is that Jesus said he would judge the nations based on how they fed the hungry, gave something to drink to the thirsty, clothed the naked, visited the sick, visited those in prison, et cetera, et cetera.
You forget about that beautiful phrase, the preferential option for the poor.
Yeah.
That always gets pushed down to, the lower ends of our political sphere, when in reality, that's where Jesus was the most.
Well, and again, and I think, at some point we should do maybe somebody will ask us a question about Jubilee, because I think everything that Jesus is about, Luke makes this really clear, but everything that Jesus is about is saying all that Jubilee stuff from Leviticus and whatever that Israel was trying to live out, that's true now. And what is that Jubilee stuff about? It's about canceling debts, freeing prisoners, redistribution of wealth. That's in the Bible. That's not Rob. That's like Leviticus 25 and surrounding area. And then Jesus comes and says, here it is. This is the year of the Lord's favor, which is the Jubilee year. And that's why the Lord's Prayer, it frustrates me to no end. I hate to agree with Presbyterians, but they translate this better. Forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors. That's the language. That's the word in the Lucan version, anyway, of the Lord's Prayer. And also save us from the time of trial. The trial is almost always in Jesus's time about debts. So that whole Lord's Prayer is about economic politics. So, and again, that doesn't mean it's not about other stuff. It's just that's the controlling, I don't even want to say a metaphor, because Jesus meant it literally and then pushed it to, that's the sort of controlling picture to talk about everything else too. And why did he do that? Because he was surrounded by poor people and they were all in debt. And he knew what liberation meant for them. We have this weird, again, abstracted idea of, are you saved? Are you saved? We don't even know what we're being saved from. I don't think we know what that language is.
Say for. I think it's very key for us too. We think these are all modern issues. If we just dive, like, Father Rob always talks about Basil the Great on social justice. This was written in the mid 300s. I mean, this is not something that was, came out in 1964 or something like that. I mean, John Chrysostom spoke lengthy on wealth and all kinds of stuff. The church has been preaching this stuff since the time of Jesus. And it's like we have failed that we think that only come. That's why we deem it to be the gospel is part of a political party, because I always say, I think one of the biggest sadnesses in the church is most of Christians stopped their theological education when they got confirmed when they were 13. And we as clergy have allowed that to happen. I blame on shepherds. And so we don't know our faith. We don't know what Christ has taught. We don't know what the church has taught. And so then we assume that our political gang signs are where the gospel is truly coming from. And it's just not true. I think we'll get into that on question 3. There's just so many topics that surround voting when it comes to issues that are important to God, the dignity of every human person, solidarity with the poor and the marginalized, and creation, and racism issues, and all of that is in there. That's why Mother Tricia talks about, she read an interesting column from an evangelical John Piper this week, who is discussing abortion, and we can have a whole thing on abortion. We don't need to get into it today, but he used a very scriptural argument how you could be anti-abortion and vote out corruption. And so I don't think, getting back to the question, I don't think we can choose a candidate based on one issue. Just as your salvation is not based off of one issue, our relationship with God is bigger than that. And I think we need to delve into the depths of the church's understanding of social justice and moral theology that helps inform our conscience, enables us to vote for politicians and policies that more line up with the gospel. It's not going to line up fully, because you're never going to find salvation in your political gang. You never will. And I think that's what our problem is right now, is we feel like this candidate or that candidate or this party is going to bring peace and unity and salvation to the world, and that ain't going to happen.
Well, I mean, that's why part of it, I think, is just to stop saying I'm a Republican or a Democrat. That's just got to stop. Christians can't be. Jesus is neither a Republican or Democrat. We can't be Republicans or Democrats. You just got to stop that. Mm-hmm. And when people ask you what's your political party, you can say I don't have one. By the way, the founding fathers of this country, for what it's worth, they were against political parties.
Hated political parties.
So there's that. But if you're going to give a snippy, funny answer, it's to say I'm a Christian. And that's going to mess people up because, again, they're going to assume that means a whole bunch of stuff related to sexuality and abortion and stuff like that. But I'm all about upsetting people's understanding of what Christians are and what the church is. And the reality is, again, I mean, Rich is asking what content do I access for information about current events. That's way too complicated, but I will tell you that none of that matters if you're not steeped in.
We're done already. Okay.
If you're not steeped in Jesus, and you're not steeped in the like people like Basil the Great, and again, people like Stanley Hauerwas, David Bentley Hart. They're just a bunch of folks who are writing about this stuff right now, and doing it deep out of a deep understanding of the tradition. I mean, most of us don't know even really what folks like Aquinas say on things, or but certainly like John Chrysostom. If you read his 7 sermons on wealth, it's like, I think people would assume that he was a communist, but the reality is or that he was a Marxist. He was saying the stuff literally 300 might as well 1500 years before Marx was born. So that's a non sequitur. It doesn't make sense. They're far more radical than somebody like Marx, and in some ways far more conservative theologically than the most liberal Christian today. So for what that's worth. So Rich, I wish I could give you an obvious a straight up answer, but I'm happy to talk to you offline about what I've been paying attention to lately. But my sense right now is that you've got to be steeped in the church tradition, and then you can sort of take a look at whatever you want and always be asking the questions.
Cool. We have a question here from Mother Tricia, but goes right into the third question. So let's start the third question and we'll jump into that. So Joe from Boise says, how do we deal with the political divide that is sweeping our nation? What's a good Christian to do? So how do we deal with the political divide that is sweeping our nation? What's a good Christian to do? And we're going to start. I want to, I know I keep going back to this Roman document, but I've been pretty impressed by it. And I think just reading from it, which comes from the World Day of Peace message by Paul VI, explaining solidarity, but it kind of goes into this question about the political divide. This comes from, I think it was January of 72. We are one human family. Whatever our national, racial, ethnic, economic, and ideological differences, we are brothers and sisters wherever we may be. Loving our neighbor has global dimensions and requires us to eradicate racism and address the extreme poverty and disease plaguing so much of the world. Solidarity also includes the scriptural call to welcome the stranger among us, including immigrants seeking work, by assuring that they have opportunities for a safe home, education for their children, decent life for their families, by ending the practice of separating families through deportation. In light of the gospel's invitation to be peacemakers, our commitment to solidarity with our neighbors at home and abroad also demands that we promote peace and justice in a whole world marred by terrible violence and conflict. If you want peace, you got to work for justice. And that's Paul VI. So when we talk about the intrinsic value of the human person, we're talking about the totality of that and what that means across the globe. We're in solidarity with each other, with our neighbors. Remember, the greatest commandment is to love God and to love your neighbor. Jesus didn't put an asterisk next to neighbor and say who that actually was. It's everyone. We're all in this together. That's what solidarity is. So Mother Church's question is, what is solidarity and is in the Gospels? Yes. Jesus came for all. And we are all in this together. St. Paul tells us there is no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, a woman or man. We are all one in Christ by what he did through his passion, death, and resurrection. And so this political divide that we have in our country, Christians are feeding the beast. As Father Rob mentioned in the beginning, we like to label ourselves part of our, I like to call it the political gang signs of Democrat or Republican or right, left, center, whatever. And because that's so easy for us then to write off the other person. And I'm seeing it all the time on Facebook, and it drives me nuts. Well, the Democrats or the Redumbicans, and you hear all of this language. And I always like to say, people, what are you even talking about? What's the issue? And because we don't want to dive into informing our conscience, we'd rather just label someone and move them off as a moron instead of actually going into the faith and what Christ is teaching us. And it goes back to the core that we are all one human family and we are all in this together. And that's part of our baptismal covenant. I say to people, I hate to break this news to you, but there won't be any political conventions in heaven. There also won't be any country flags. The only symbol that's going to be in heaven is the cross. That's it. And so we're not going to have any of this divide in heaven because the kingdom comes to bring us one.
Yeah, I mean, right. We want to do this thing. I remember Sam Wells saying at one time when he came to speak to a bunch of clergy in the Diocese of Missouri, that America has this funny version of Christianity where what we've decided is that America's become the promised land. It's taken Israel's place, and that Jesus's main function by second person of the Trinity, by taking flesh as Jesus Christ, his main function was to explain that Israel was no longer the promised land, to make a space for America to become the promised land, and that's it. And in that sense, when you're talking about shouldn't we be separating politics from religion, I do think that doesn't separate them, but it's a bad version of politics. So I would call that a Christian heresy, and I would like to deal with the politics of that by calling it out as heresy. But I do think what's a good Christian to do is to, again, reject any party affiliation, period. I understand that you may have to, because some states, I think, still require for primaries registering as one thing or another. I've never registered in any party and never will. I think actually trying to hear past the propaganda, because it's all propaganda, and to hear what's really being said and what's really being asked, who it serves. And then, to do like Dorothy Day, right? It's just remember who Jesus loves and who Jesus wants to be with. And the fact that Jesus saves people in different ways. So the poor he saves by proclaiming good news that they won't always be poor and trying to find ways to care for them. And the rich he saves and loves by telling them you've got too much money. That's what the Magnificat's about. That your money is actually spiritually problematic for you. That's that whole thing about don't store up the stuff in the barn houses, you might die. It's harder for the rich person to get into the kingdom of God than it is for the camel to go through the eye of the needle. All those kind of things. Jesus keeps saying this stuff over and over again. And
go ahead.
We keep saying like, well, I know that that's a spiritual problem, but if I'm going to have a spiritual problem, that's the one I want to have. That's kind of funny, but I think that really minimizes the spiritual danger of wealth. So that's where we.
I can't remember which kind of mega church prosperity gospel evangelist this was, but when it came to the discussion on the eye, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle, which was a small door Jesus was referencing. And because camels were packed with stuff, they couldn't get through the door. They were holding on to the baggage. And this prosperity gospel is that if you just believe God is going to bless you with tremendous amounts of wealth, and that's why this particular evangelist had multiple airlines and mansions and whatever, said that, well, the camel to get through the door would have to drop through its knees. And so therefore, if you pray, you're able to take all of your wealth in, which is not what Jesus was talking about.
What Jesus was getting at. Right. Well, again, you can't line it up with everything else. It's like, Jesus also says, you cannot serve God and wealth. I mean, that's a pretty clear statement. And also Jesus says in the Sermon on the Plain, woe to you rich. So all I'm saying is you can do a bunch of that kind of gymnastic stuff, but that sort of spiritual, mental, theological gymnastics that you want, but then don't tell me that you want to have a plain understanding of scripture everywhere else. That's not a game you want to play. And what I do know is that Jesus cared for the people that empire didn't care for. And the good news was that God loved them and God was going to do something about it. And again, if you read Revelation, you can see what God's doing about it longer term. So all I'm saying is don't join those Republican Democrat stuff, but also don't listen. So when they accuse the Pope of being a Marxist, even though he's quoting Basil the Great and John Chrysostom and those kind of folks, don't fall for that. He's quoting the church tradition. He's not quoting Marx. And just start, again, asking questions like, where's this coming from? Who does it serve? And then remember that our thing, and again, Dorothy Day is a great example of this, our thing is to be with the people Jesus is with. And that's the poorest of the poor. And that's the people who have been rejected by the bigger society.
People always say to me, well, how's it going to change? It's not going to change until the church is the church, to be quite frank. And at least here in America. And this deep political divide, until Christians are willing to give up their gang signs for the cross, it's just going to get worse. And, I'm just watching fights between people online, and hateful things are being said. And we forget the dignity of every human being. We forget that every single person, even those who oppose you on a different side of a political platform, are made in the image and likeness of God, and seeing Christ in our neighbor. It's never going to change, but it's only going to change if Christians start living out the gospel and calling themselves Christians and citizens of the kingdom before they call themselves in a political party or whatever.
And I would say, we have to judge whether we're here or not. But mostly division is bad. But even Jesus said, I come not to bring peace, but a sword. And I come to set, mothers-in-law against, whatever, all the whole thing that these different people, that sometimes division is okay. And again, a great example of that is we could have avoided division by not engaging in the civil rights movement, right? Except what was going on was that there was a sort of a polite quietness about the fact that we were already divided. So what looks like division sometimes is actually just naming and making clear the division that already exists and saying, we're not going to live into that anymore. I think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer also. I mean, the church literally divided. There was a Reich church. And then there were the traditional churches, and the Reich Church became the only legal church, unless you were Roman Catholic. It's kind of complicated, but so all the Protestants had to be a part of the Reich Church, and so Bonhoeffer had to like set up a seminary in exile, a hidden seminary to train pastors to actually fight against the powers, to fight against Hitler. So. I don't want to say that we're there now. I don't like to be hyperbolic, but I don't think we should always reject division per se. There's bad division and good division. Some division is necessary. Some stuff that we think is division is, again, just recognizing a division that has existed forever. But we thought it was fine. It's like when we do that weird nostalgic thing, we look back to the 50s and everything was so nice in the 50s. Well, it was nice if you were white. But it wasn't if you were black. It's like it was if you were straight, but it wasn't if you were gay. So there was division then. We just didn't name it. And we didn't talk about it. So sometimes what looks like it's some new division is actually just a revealing of a division that has existed for a long time.
Yeah, and some of the division what you're talking about is separating us from our idols, and that's painful. Because once you become, an idol worshiper, you become that which you worship, and that's why it's completely painful to give that up.
Absolutely. Yes, you become more and more the thing that you worship. And so if what you're worshiping is wealth, if you're worshiping America, if you're worshiping whiteness, if you're worshiping whatever, you've got to take a look at that God that you're worshiping and stand it up next to Jesus and see how they relate to each other. Because I would also say, there are idols that are carved in the image of Jesus, in the sense that they look like him and have his name, but actually have nothing to do with the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, the big announcement reading of Isaiah in the synagogue. And those are actually almost the most dangerous idols of all. The idol that we name Jesus but actually has nothing to do with Jesus is the most dangerous, because then we think we're Christians.
Right. Well, our Lord kind of says that to himself, says it to us too in Matthew 7, not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of God.
But those who do the will of my Father.
But those who do the will of my Father.
Right. So a big chunk of it is we've got to find ways to walk the walk. We can't just say, love Jesus. And I mean, that's, if I have a problem with Bishop Curry's like Jesus movement kind of talk, it's like, I want to know which Jesus he's talking about, because there are lots of Jesuses. And so who is that? Is it well, I don't want to go through a list of all the possible Jesuses, because that'll just raise a bunch more trouble and we'll be here forever. But
we got 6 minutes and 45 seconds, so we do have some time.
Yes.
But I do want to kind of keep it open if people have follow-up questions or comments to chime in, because that'll help kind of round out this discussion. It's good to hear from you all as well too. But yeah, I think, once again, it goes back to our baptismal vows for me to answer the question on how do we deal with the political divide is, this Sunday we'll be renewing our baptismal vows, because it's our parish feast day, and it's All Saints Day coming up this Sunday. It's hard to believe it's November 1st on Sunday. So we'll be renewing our baptismal vows. And if you're going to stand up and say you seek to strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being, I hope you mean what you say. And that means doing everything in your power to break down the divides that separate us.
I mean, I think this is hard to imagine, but there's a story in Vichy, France, with the Nazis coming in, and in fact, I don't even think it was Nazis. I think it was the French army, because they were like nervous, like asking some Jews, like, are you Jewish or are you French? It's a really hard question to ask, and because of course they're Jewish, and of course their ultimate home is, is the kingdom of God, like ours is, and their ultimate king is the God who we call, God the Father. I think Christians have to stop thinking of themselves first as part of a country, and only second as Christian. So I am more bound to a Christian in Iraq than I am to non-Christians in America, if that makes sense. Like, I don't want to kill someone. I don't want to hurt someone who I know is connected to Jesus, right? So if that person bears the image of God, and that image has even been restored in baptism and is one of the baptized, and I might receive communion with that person, how can I possibly think about wanting to hurt that person? And so there's some sense in which, and the same thing with with our race, which race is a total fake construct and doesn't exist anyway. Racism does, but race doesn't. It's like, we are literally made one. We're both part of Christ's body. How can I hurt another part of Christ's body? How can I allow to be hurt another part of Christ's body? And that's really where Christians need to be going in this.
Yeah, Don says in here, opinions result in division. And during this leadership, electoral time, political divide. I don't think it's the opinions, Don. I'll disagree with you on that, because Father Rob and I disagree on stuff, but I love him to death. He's my brother. He's my brother in Christ, and so it's not the necessarily disagreeing opinion. It's a civil discourse that we have lost all sense of in our country, because we're programmed now by social media and corporate media, who just scream at each other for ratings and power and money. And so we figure that's the way we need to start treating each other. So I think it's not necessarily a difference of opinion. It's the way we actually treat each other and actually have healthy and holy debates and dialogues. I mean, you see that in Acts of the Apostles. The church had a debate. It ended in the First Council of Jerusalem. But they weren't stabbing each other and, and punching. Well, that has happened in church history many times. But it's not the opinions that result in the division. It's how we treat each other in those opinions.
And I do think there is a level in which, if someone says I don't have a right to exist, or that my very existence is a problem, I don't blame the person who has been told that for arguing back. That's not a difference of opinion. So, again, I think of, trans friends who are told that they can't, that's wrong, that's just wrong by nature. And that their experience of that is invalid, wrong, whatever. But they know it's true. So how can they're basically being told you shouldn't exist, or if you do exist, please don't do it in front of me. How are they supposed to live that way? So that's not a matter of opinion, right? That's an existential reality. Mm-hmm. So if someone's gay and has to hide for most of their life, that opinion of saying I actually would like to be who I am, that has a higher value for me than someone's opinion who says, no, you shouldn't. Because that person over there, it's kind of like when we were talking about the abortion question, two men talking about this, it's a little tricky. That you can't, I don't know how you can have that conversation without having a woman in the conversation. Yeah. And so I don't think there are opinions that are intrinsically, by definition, hurtful, and to the point, and ultimately even to the point of death in some cases. So that opinion actually needs to be, that opinion can be divisive. But in that case, I don't need to hear both sides. Do you know what I mean? Because one side actually kills people. And so I'm okay with being divided on that. I'm okay with that.
We have like 20 seconds left. And Linda, one final question. Linda says, so how do we do it? And how do we have civil debates? I think you have to, number one, that you have to always look at the other person as being loved and made in the image and likeness of God, even if they completely disagree with you. I think you need to know your own stuff. And I think you need to know what triggers you and what causes you to be angry. And we need to work on that as people with our spiritual director, going to confession, whatever. I think that has to do with that. I think you need to ask open-ended sentences, use facts and not fiery rhetoric. I think those are some ways we need to teach us to begin to enter back into civil discourse, and not learn that from what we see on TV.
Yeah, I think a deep listening is a key thing, and that's so listening, not just because you can do the lawyery thing, right, and like kind of listen to the facts and say, okay, we got that fact wrong, so this whole thing is off and whatever. But I mean, I think it's really helpful to do kind of what we learn to do in clinical pastoral education, which is you listen to what's being said on the surface, but you try to hear on some level what's being said under the surface, and then you ask questions to clarify, I'm kind of hearing this. Is this what you mean? Like those kinds of things. And obviously, unfortunately, we have folks these days who just want to be the winners. They want to have like a Aaron Sorkin moment, or they want to have like the Dirty Harry moment, whatever in the movie. They want to play it like it's a movie and I gotcha. And you're just never going to be able to go deep.
That's what Linda said. I think when we debate, we're always trying to convince the other, and we're trying to win.
I'm trying to win. And Gandhi's take, Martin Luther King's take, is that actually, like, so MLK is a great example. I know we're over time. MLK is a great example because he says his whole thing is that everybody's suffering under racism, and they're doing it in different ways. And even the people who look like they're winning are suffering because their souls are being deformed. They're in real trouble, like in deep trouble. So Martin Luther King's thing was that everybody has to win. And so racism needed to be defeated, not just because the people who are suffering physically under it and spiritually and emotionally and mentally under it in the obvious ways needed to be liberated from it, and they did, and that's primary, but also because the people who were making it happen or presiding over it and benefiting from it are also in deep spiritual trouble. Their souls are in trouble. And Martin Luther King wanted to save the white oppressor as much as he wanted to save the black oppressed. And I think that's the kind of move that you can make if you're actually looking at the person across from you and saying, that's why if I want to name a name, Hillary Clinton calling people deplorables was not helpful, right? We know what the other side does, but Hillary Clinton saying that was actually problematic. Like, there are people who we think we can write off, but God doesn't write off anybody. So a big piece of it is to be able to listen. And sometimes that means to say the hard things that they don't want to hear also because you love them. But you've still got to say it not out of I'm going to get you, I'm going to win and whatever, but because you don't want them suffering under that stuff in a spiritual way or whatever too. Whatever you do, you're doing out of love in the end. That's the key. And also easier said than done, but that's the ideal. That's the goal.
Wow, that was pretty good. Didn't think we'd have a whole lot to say. We had a whole lot to say. So once again, thanks for everybody for tuning in today. Hope you got a lot out of this. As you go to the ballot box on Tuesday, or if you've already voted.
I think a bunch of our folks have already voted, but
probably. I voted on October 3rd, so I've been done for a while, but please submit your questions, no matter what it is. It could be as simple as why we wear green. Please submit your questions to 3 questions and 2 priests at questions@allsaintsnewalbany.org. So submit those questions to questions@allsaintsnewalbany.org. Or even if you have follow-up questions from today's episode or another episode or whatever, or if you have an idea of something you would like us to talk about, just type that in. That's fine too. That gives us an idea, because this is all about helping you grow in your faith and in discipleship. So please do that. Anything?
I really want to encourage those follow-up questions, because if you've watched every episode, you can probably notice that something like resurrection of the body, incarnation, actually has informed the way we've talked about politics, right? Just all those kind of follow-up questions help us make connections between these things that seem like they don't have anything to do with each other.
Right, right. All right, everybody. I think that's going to be good for today. It's going to take me a while to kind of stop the stuff, but thank you all for watching and listening. Be not afraid. Christ is risen. Have a great week, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Bye, Pax Christi.